The choice they gave her was no choice at all. Lady Alara Voss stood at the narrow window of her father's study, watching the frost claim the last of the autumn garden, while behind her, two men decided the shape of her remaining life. Her father, Baron Aldrich Voss, spoke in the careful, clipped tones of a man performing regret he did not feel. Beside him, the Crown's appointed solicitor rustled papers with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to ruining young women before luncheon. "The convent in Lyon accepts penitents of good family," the solicitor offered, discreetly, permanently. "Or," her father said, and paused in the way men pause when they believe they are being generous, "the Duke of Ashford has agreed to the arrangement." Alara did not turn from the window. Outside, a single bronze leaf detached from the oak tree and fell without ceremony into the gray morning. She understood it completely. Lord Cavendish had told his version of events first. That was the whole of it, the entire machinery of her destruction, assembled in that single fact. He was the Queen's favorite nephew, charming at every dinner table in London, and she was the daughter of a baron whose debts were whispered about in the same breath as his name. When she had shoved Cavendish away in the darkened gallery of the Pembroke ball, when she had slapped him hard enough that the sound reached the corridor, she had believed, for one bright and foolish moment, that truth would be sufficient armor. Truth, she had since learned, was only armor for people who could afford it. Cavendish had wept apparently, spoken of a misunderstanding, a hysterical girl, a malicious interpretation of innocent attention. Society had nodded sympathetically, adjusted its cravats, and turned on her with the focused enthusiasm of a group with nothing more pressing to occupy its morality. Lady Alara Voss, they agreed, was difficult, unstable, an embarrassment to a family already balanced on the edge of ruin, the convent or the Duke. "How old did you say he was?" she asked, still facing the window. 60, her father said. "A widower, quiet man, keeps largely to his estate in Yorkshire. You won't be troubled by society." Troubled by society, as though society were weather, as though she had not just been publicly dismantled by it. "Fine," she said. "The Duke." The wedding was held on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate. Tuesdays were for unremarkable things, account settlements, dental extractions, the quiet interment of hope. The church was full, because London society would travel considerable distances to observe a fall from grace, and Alara Voss's fall had been anticipated with something approaching theatrical excitement. She wore her mother's ivory gown, altered and aged at the hem, and she walked the aisle with her chin at an angle that she had practiced in her mirror for 3 consecutive mornings. She would not look diminished. She would not give them that. Edmund Ashford was already standing at the altar when she arrived. She had expected, she did not know precisely what she had expected. Something confirming. Something that would justify the dread that had settled in her chest like river silt. A leer, perhaps. A proprietary satisfaction. The bearing of a man who understood he had been handed something society had already broken and therefore felt owed nothing gentle. Instead, she found a tall man with silver hair worn slightly long, a dark coat that was well-made but not ostentatious, and an expression of such composed neutrality that she could not read it at all. He did not look at her with hunger. He did not look at her with pity. He looked at her the way one looks at weather, observantly, without judgment, simply taking note of what was true. The ceremony was brief. The register was signed. The congregation applauded with the politeness reserved for performances they had not entirely enjoyed. Someone near the back laughed at something. She did not turn to see what. In the carriage north to Yorkshire, they did not speak for the first hour. Alara sat rigid against her window, braced for something she could not name. The Duke read. An actual book, spine cracked and heavily annotated, which he held with the ease of a man who had been reading in carriages for 4 decades and had made his peace with the motion. After the second hour, without looking up, he said, "There is a hamper beneath the seat if you're hungry. Mrs. Holt packs well." Alara looked at him. He turned a page. She did not touch the hamper. Ashford Estate emerged from the Yorkshire dark like something from a fever dream, enormous, silver gray in the moonlight, flanked by oaks that had been old when the current duke was born. She had imagined something austere and punishing. What she found was a house that seemed, in a quality she could not immediately name, inhabited. Not merely occupied, inhabited. As though it had been genuinely lived in by people who had genuinely loved it. The housekeeper, Mrs. Holt, a compact woman of 50 with kind eyes she kept professionally restrained, showed Alara to her rooms. They were not the secondary rooms she had steeled herself for. They were the Duchess's chambers, east-facing, high-ceilinged, lined on one wall with bookshelves that someone had recently and thoroughly stocked. She stood in the center of the room for a long time after Mrs. Holt withdrew. Then Edmund appeared briefly in the connecting doorway, she startled, and said, with the same unreadable composure he had maintained since the altar, "I have no interest in your obedience, only your honesty. Sleep well, Lady Ashford." The door closed quietly. Alara stood there, furious at how thoroughly he had failed to be what she needed him to be. She found the library an hour later, following the smell of old paper and candle wax through the dark house. It was magnificent, 2 stories, a rolling ladder, maps pinned alongside portraits. And on the central reading table, a journal lying open casually as though its owner had simply stepped away mid-thought. She should not have read it. She read it. "They gave me a girl to cage. I intend to do no such thing." Alara stood in the candlelight for a long time, the journal open in her hands, and felt something she could not afford to feel shift quietly in her chest, the first hairline fracture in a wall she had spent months building. She closed the journal carefully. She returned it exactly as she had found it, and she did not sleep at all. The rules Edmund Ashford laid out on her third morning at the estate were so unreasonable in their reasonableness that Alara spent the remainder of the day in a state of quiet, burning suspicion. He had knocked at the library door, she had already claimed it, spending her mornings there with the deliberate energy of someone occupying enemy territory, and entered carrying 2 cups of coffee, which he set on the table between them with the manner of a man depositing correspondence. Then he sat, folded his hands, and told her without preamble how things would be. Full access to the estate, the house accounts, the stables. Her own mare, a gray named Sable who had been, he said, somewhat underappreciated. Her own social calendar entirely self-determined. No obligation to entertain, to perform, to be decorative at any function she found disagreeable. He asked only one thing in return, that she join him for dinner conversation. Not silent dinners. Conversation. About what? She asked, watching him carefully. "Anything with substance," he said, and picked up his coffee. She waited 3 days before joining him for dinner. She arrived armed with arguments she had been quietly sharpening about the hypocrisy of the peerage, about the intellectual vacancy of aristocratic society, about 3 specific passages from a political pamphlet she had found on his shelves that she considered dangerously naive. She laid them out over the soup course with the precision of someone expecting to be dismissed. Edmund listened to all of it. Then he disagreed with her, point by point, thoughtfully and without condescension, and by the time the fish course arrived they were in the middle of an argument so genuinely engaging that she forgot to maintain her expression of cold detachment. She caught herself leaning forward. She sat back immediately. He said nothing about it. He simply refilled her wine. This was his method, she came to understand, not seduction, not strategy, but something more quietly devastating than either. He simply created conditions, space where she could be entirely herself, and then he responded to that self as though it were not only acceptable but interesting. It was the most disorienting thing anyone had ever done to her. She retaliated by teaching herself to manage the estate. It began as defiance. She would learn everything, need nothing from him, owe him no gratitude for his magnanimous rules. She started with the household accounts, then extended outward to the tenant ledgers, the quarterly land reports, the correspondence with the estate's solicitors. It was meant to be armor. Instead, it became genuine absorption. She had a mind well suited to systems, to the satisfaction of numbers reconciling, to the long logic of land management across seasons. She never mentioned it to Edmund. She simply worked. He never mentioned it either, but she began finding things. A ledger she had been struggling to interpret, left on the library table with a single annotation in his handwriting clarifying the notation system. A letter from the land agent concerning a discrepancy in the tenant accounts, placed where she would encounter it in the course of her morning. Small things. Breadcrumbs that required no acknowledgement, no gratitude, no admission that she had needed them. The discrepancy in the tenant accounts became something considerably larger. It was November when Alara traced the full pattern, a systematic overcharging of the village tenants by Edmund's land agent, a man named Pruitt who had held the position for 8 years and clearly considered longevity a form of impunity. The figures were not subtle once you knew what you were looking at. She spent 2 days verifying everything, building the case with the thoroughness of someone who anticipated disbelief. She presented her findings to Edmund at dinner, speaking quickly, watching his face for the particular expression men wore when they were preparing to explain why she had misunderstood. He did not wear that expression. He read through her documentation in silence, asked 2 precise clarifying questions, and said, "Pruitt will be dismissed by the end of the week. The tenants will receive full restitution from the estate accounts." He looked up. "This is thorough work, Alara. It should be formally recognized as such." She had no prepared response for that. She ate her dinner very quietly. He credited her by name when meeting with the village tenants. She stood beside him in the cold December air and watched men who had been quietly enduring unfairness receive acknowledgement that someone had noticed, and she felt something she identified, uneasily, as belonging. Bath was her first real test of what she and Edmund had become, whatever that was. They attended a winter gathering at the invitation of Lord and Lady Fenwick, old friends of Edmund's, who treated Alara with genuine warmth and no apparent awareness that she was meant to be humiliated. The assembly rooms were crowded. Society had long arms. The Countess of Strayle, a woman whose entire personality appeared to have been constructed from other people's discomfort, found them near the refreshment table. Her remarks were delivered in the carrying voice of someone who wanted witnesses, something about what desperation must look like at 60, something about May and December that drew nearby laughter. Edmund set down his glass. What he said next was quiet enough that only those immediately surrounding them heard it, a single, measured observation about the Countess's long public record of confusing cruelty for wit, and the diminishing returns of that particular performance at her age. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform outrage. He simply stated it as observable fact with the calm authority of a man who had nothing to prove, and then turned back to Alara as though the conversation had concluded. The Countess said nothing further. Alara looked at him. He offered her his arm toward the dance floor with the mild expression of a man suggesting they move to a more comfortable chair. She took it without deciding to. It was in Bath, in the carriage returning to their lodgings, that she told him about Cavendish. All of it, the gallery, the darkness, the sound of her own hand against his face, the weeks that followed. She told it flatly, watching the street lamps stripe the carriage ceiling, waiting for the inevitable inadequacy of his response. Edmund said nothing for a long time. Then, "I see." 2 words. But the quality of the silence that followed them was unlike any silence she had experienced in the months of aftermath. It was not the silence of discomfort or disbelief or careful distancing. It was the silence of a man absorbing something true and deciding, with great deliberateness, what to do with it. She understood in that silence that something was being decided on her behalf, not a rescue, nothing so diminishing as that, but something precise and patient and entirely certain of itself. She did not ask what it was. January came, and with it, Edmund's heart. Not his feelings, those she was still refusing to inventory, but his actual heart, which had carried a weakness since his late 40s and chose the coldest week of the year to make itself known. He collapsed in the study on a Thursday morning. The physician came, spoke in serious tones about rest and restriction, and left a list of instructions Edmund immediately set aside. Alara moved the instructions back to his eyeline. He moved them away again. This became, absurdly, a pattern. She told herself she sat with him out of practical obligation. Someone had to ensure he followed the physician's orders, and the household staff were too deferential to manage it. She told herself this on the first day, and the second, and by the third day she had stopped telling herself anything and was simply sitting in the chair beside his bed, reading aloud from Middlemarch, a book she had previously dismissed as overwrought in the particular lamplight of late afternoon. His breathing steadied. The color returned to his face by degrees. She read 3 chapters before she noticed that somewhere in the second, her voice had lost its careful flatness and become something quieter and more genuine, as though the room had earned it. She was asleep in the chair when he woke on the 4th morning, a book open and fallen against her chest, her hair unpinned and her careful composure entirely unguarded. The winter light came pale through the curtains and lay gently across her face. Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached for the coat folded over the arm of the chair and placed it with great care over her shoulders. He did not wake her. He simply lay back, folded his hands, and allowed himself, for the first time in 15 years, to feel completely and terrifyingly at peace. She pulled away in February. Alara was precise about it, methodical, even. She resumed formal address at dinner. She shortened their conversations with the surgical efficiency of someone who knew exactly which threads to cut. She returned to her rooms earlier each evening, and if Edmund noticed the coat she still folded over the chair arm each night before sleeping, she told herself it meant nothing. She had excellent reasons. She had catalogued them. He was 36 years her senior. His heart had already demonstrated its unreliability once, and the physician's careful language had not disguised what it meant, that Edmund Ashford would not grow old alongside her so much as continue being old, and then one day simply stop. She had already lost her reputation, her freedom, and her faith in the fundamental fairness of the world. She would not hand what remained of herself to a man she was certain to outlive and lose. It was logical. It was self-preserving. It made her thoroughly miserable. Edmund did not chase her. He did not alter his manner, did not fill her deliberate silences with appeals or questions or wounded reproach. He simply remained himself, present, steady, reading by the fire in the evenings, leaving interesting things in her path, disagreeing with her about politics over dinners she kept shortening, and he kept making worth staying for. Then the letter arrived. It was placed outside her door on a Wednesday morning, sealed with no formality, her name written in his unhurried hand. She read it standing in the corridor. He wrote that he understood what she was doing and why, that she owed him nothing, not warmth, not presence, not feeling of any kind, that the marriage had been imposed on her without her genuine consent, and that a document signed under those conditions carried, in his view, no moral weight. He had spoken with his solicitor. The arrangement could be quietly dissolved. She would leave with the Ashford name intact, a private income settled in her own right, and his complete silence on every matter. She could go to London, to the continent, wherever she chose. She could build a life of her own construction entirely. "You came here in chains," he wrote. "I will not be another set." Alara read it twice. Then she walked directly to his study and opened the door without knocking, which she had never done before. Edmund looked up from his desk. "This letter," she said, holding it up, "is the single most infuriating thing you have ever done." He waited. "I don't want a dissolution," she said. "I don't want London. I don't want the continent." She set the letter on his desk. "I want you to stop being so extraordinarily reasonable about everything, because it makes it completely impossible to maintain any sensible distance from you, and I have been trying very hard." Something shifted in his expression, not surprise, but the particular quality of a man setting down a weight he had been carrying carefully for a long time. Lord Cavendish found them at the Crown Spring Gala in April, which was the worst possible choice he ever made. He approached with his familiar architecture of charm and insinuation, his voice projected for the surrounding guests, something about titles acquired through scandal, about what doors remained open to women of her particular history. Alara turned to face him with the full, settled calm of someone who had stopped being afraid of this moment. She spoke for approximately 90 seconds. She did not raise her voice. She outlined, with the clarity of someone who had spent months studying how power worked and how it could be precisely, legally, and permanently dismantled, exactly what she knew about him, what she had documented, and what she fully intended to do with it if he spoke her name in any room again. Cavendish left the gala early. Across the room, Edmund watched the entire exchange without moving. When she returned to his side, he said nothing. He simply looked at her with an expression that several nearby guests would later struggle to describe accurately, eventually settling on the word proud, though it was considerably more than that. In the carriage home, the city sliding past in amber lamplight, Alara told him all of it. How she had arrived expecting a captor. How she had found something language kept failing to adequately contain. How she was terrified of the size of what she felt, and how that terror was, at this point, entirely insufficient to stop her feeling it. Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then, "You already love me, and I have been in love with you since the day you corrected my estate ledger in red ink and left it on my desk without a word of apology." She laughed, a real one, unguarded and sudden, and the sound of it filled the carriage like light fills a room when someone finally opens the curtains. They did not have a grand climax. They had something better. They had mornings. The shared library, their chairs angled toward each other by such gradual degrees that neither could have identified the day it happened. They had arguments about books that lasted through dinner and resumed at breakfast. Alara took formal co-ownership of the estate, documented, legal, permanent. Edmund's health steadied through the spring. The Dowager Duchess, after 6 months of sustained disapproval, informed Mrs. Holt that the new Duchess was tolerable, which Mrs. Holt correctly understood to be extraordinary praise. One evening in May, Alara sat at the library desk and opened her own journal new, its spine uncracked, and wrote in the same room where she had once stood in candlelight reading a stranger's words and felt her certainty begin to fracture. She wrote, "I came here in chains I could not see." He spent a year quietly, patiently cutting everyone. Across the room, Edmund turned a page. Outside, the Yorkshire spring was entirely indifferent to the fact that something inside that house had been, after a very long time and against very considerable odds, gently and permanently repaired.